Would there be any advice you'd give yourself or somebody who was doing those same things now? If you identified somebody doing it, what would you tell them?
Man, it's there's so many. I get asked this question a lot because I get often invited to speak at different events, and sometimes it's to 10th graders, and sometimes it's to 50th graders. Um, and the answers are a little different, um, but I guess the biggest thing is learn to set aside fear, and we don't necessarily recognize fear for what it is, and like for example, how procrastination is so based in fear, and it's fear of change. It could be fear of failing. It could be a fear of success. And I didn't even recognize how true that could be for me because fear of success, you might think, well, that doesn't even make any sense, but it does when you have a fear of loss, because it's way easier to never have something than to have it and lose it.
Mm.
So when I started recognizing how much fear was playing, fear of judgment, fear of criticism, fear of acceptance, all of these different things, and we have five basic fears that some physicist whose name I can't hardly pronounce came up with a while back. And it's basically boiled down to this. It's fear of death, fear of pain, fear of restriction, fear of separation, and fear of humiliation. And if you look at those five basic fears, all of them, and that can happen. Any of those fears can actually be experienced in a physical sense, in a an emotional sense, a spiritual sense. You can have physical death and emotional death and spiritual death. You can have pain of, so you have death, pain, restriction, separation, humiliation, and restriction. But those things, when you start to recognize the fears and how much fear plays in your life, that was holding me back in so many ways. Even fear of being found out, like, oh my gosh, like, what if I don't know? And this is probably one of the things that held me back the most, is the fact that I feared not looking like I didn't know something. I had a couple conversations with people yesterday who were inquiring about working with me as a strategist, and they're like, "Well, what is it like to work with you?" And we had been on a call already for 45 minutes at that point in time. We were getting ready to land the plane, and I said, "I'm like, well, what's it like to work with you?" And I said, "Look, man, right now you're doing everything that you need to do, because you're 28 years old and you're asking questions and asking for help from someone who's in their early 50s, that has been there, who's done it wrong way more than they've done it right, and I couldn't do that in my late 20s. There's no way I could." And that sets them up so much more for success than I ever could have. So it was interesting that when I started to get really clear about what it was that I was afraid of and learn how to set that fear aside, then that's really when things started to change for me. And that was probably in my mid to late 30s. And it delayed me probably 10 years of my life to get that figured out. So I think the main thing is, right, identify the fear in your life, and and work on affirmations and declarations to change that. Lean into your fear. Failure is a lot easier when you have a whole support system behind you, right? So, like, if I could call you, Kevin, and say, "Hey, man, Kevin, I had kind of a rough sales call. Hey, can you give? I need 3 minutes from you. Tell me I'm pretty. Tell me, like, build me back up," right? So much easier to do that when you have a really good support system. Failure is just so much easier to experience, and failure is so necessary for our learning and for our growth. So don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to maybe be judged, because if you're being judged, then you're being judged by someone who's maybe operating from a lesser stance in you, a lesser station in life, and maybe they're operating from jealousy. Maybe they're operating because they want to protect you, and they don't know how else to do it but try to tear your dreams down. Lean into those fears and do the things anyway, and find ways to operate in spite of fear and not be succumbed to it.